Okay, so I'm going to be talking about our project Mirabal, and in particular how we looked to move beyond safety to look at what success means in terms of domestic violence perpetrator programs, what we mean when we say success, and the six measures which we've used here in our multi-site study across England, Wales, and Scotland. Okay, so the story so far, in terms of what we know in the UK, is that we've had widespread skepticism from multiple directions about the ability for men who use violence within relationships to change. And that skepticism has come partly from the women's movement, but also from criminal justice partners as well, like the police, offender management, etc. We found we see probably as much resistance from law enforcement as we do from women's voluntary sector, sometimes more actually about the ability of men to change. We also think that domestic violence perpetrator programs, as we call them, I know you call them battery intervention programs, so anywhere we have DVPPs, that's domestic violence perpetrator program, we know that we think that they're subject to more intense scrutiny than other responses. So we knew when we started the research that a lot of programs were being told, kind of looking for funding to continue their program, and being made to demonstrate, well, does it work? And then the next question after that, what do you mean by work? And things were getting kind of a bit stilted at that point in terms of being able to get funding. And we think that there's a lot of other interventions which go on in the world, as well as in the domestic violence field, but more broadly as well, that do receive funding, which aren't needed to show to this extent that they are successful in whatever definition you're using then. Internationally, research shows some mixed results. I know you'll be hearing some more about that probably as the day goes on, so I'm not going to be reviewing the literature now on perpetrator programme evaluations. Suffice to say that here in the UK, we've had very little research, but that we have had has been fairly successful, fairly positive. Excuse me. The Doorbashers did some work in Scotland where they compared men who were on criminal justice, who'd received a criminal justice programme as their intervention, and they compared that with people who'd received a different type of criminal justice intervention, such as a fine or community service. And they found a lower reoffending rate amongst the group who had received the domestic violence perpetrator programme intervention. Really, that's the only outcome study that we had in the UK until we did our study, our multi-site study. I did just want to say a few words about the model that we operate within the UK. So we have programmes both inside and outside the criminal justice system. So we have programmes run by probation, run by prison, and those men tend to be in different type of programs, different groups to the men who are referred by GPs, by child contact, by child support, etc. But whether they're inside or outside the criminal justice system, sorry, I should also say that in the UK, our programs don't tend to charge men either. They tend to be funded externally as well, although that's obviously a difficult thing that they're struggling with. The other thing I wanted to just say about the UK specific model is that the women, the partners, the ex-partners are given access to a women's safety and support worker while for the length of time and sometimes a bit after that the man is on the programme. So just to move on, tell you a bit about Project Mirabal. It was a broad and a long programme of research. So we did kind of lots of different strands to it, too many to go through today. And if we added it all up, we've probably been doing this project for about 5 years now. So the main aim of the research overall was to understand what domestic violence perpetrator programs contribute to coordinate community approaches to domestic violence. So our question wasn't, do they work? It was, if you, and it certainly wasn't, should you have men's services versus women's services? It's saying that if you've already got other services in place in an area, if you've already got support for women and children, what difference does adding a perpetrator programme make to that area? Today I'm going to mainly be talking about our measures of change amongst the men on the programmes. I know that's the bit which most people tend to be interested in, but I think there's a link at the end to our website which has all of our other aspects of the study on. So just as a reminder that I put non-CJS, so our non-criminal justice perpetrators. These aren't men who've been made to go by the criminal justice court as part of their sentence. I did just want to highlight, we do have this new Istanbul Convention across Europe. At the moment, the UK has signed it but not ratified it. But I just thought you might be interested to see the wording that the Istanbul Convention, which, as I say, hopefully, you know, all countries allied to the Council of Europe would be signing this, which does actually require state parties to set up or support programmes and also ensuring the safety and support for the victims who are associated with the men. So I just wanted to put that up because I think that's quite a bold statement to make, and I think it actually signifies quite a step forward in terms of kind of the trust that people are beginning to have in domestic violence perpetrator programs. Okay, so we started a study called What Counts as Success? And this really was because we kept getting this question, you know, but do they work? And we kept saying, well, it depends what you mean by do they work? What is your definition of work? So we wanted to be really clear about what counts as success. And we wanted particularly not just to use definitions that included reductions in physical violence. And we also wanted to be able to look at reductions and kind of whether broadly things were getting better, not kind of has there been one more physical incident of violence, yes or no, right, that's a failure. We did 73 interviews. We interviewed the women and the men which were linked to the domestic violence perpetrator programs, and also staff and funders and commissioners as well. And we wanted to look at domestic violence as it is lived, a pattern of coercive control. And that's why, following the work of Evan Stark from the US, it meant that we were really centred not just on safety, but also on women's freedom as well. And this was reflected in women's definitions of success in particular, and kind of felt like it really echoed with the work that myself and Liz Kelly had previously done, which was all with victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So these are the 6 areas that we came up with in terms of what we count as success. As I say, it came from all of those interviews with the different sorry, it's a horrible researchy term, but with the different stakeholders, different people who had some kind of stake in domestic violence perpetrator programs. So you'll see that measure 3 is safety and freedom from violence and abuse for women and children. So this is the measure, particularly the safety, maybe not so much the freedom, but number 3 is the area which most evaluations seem to be focused on. But as I say, our research programme looks across the 6. I'm not going to be able to talk through the findings for all of those 6 today. I think I'm talking maybe about 3 or 4 of them. So what we were doing was asking a wider question. We weren't just asking the question of whether a domestic violence perpetrator who starts on a programme re-assaults, yes or no. We weren't asking that sort of question. And this was very much the need to go wider with this and the need to locate it within a coordinated community response was very much we we became aware that this was really important through the work of Ed Gondolf, and he came over from the US to advise, certainly to advise Respect, who were commissioning, who are our national organisation for domestic violence perpetrator programmes, and who were commissioning researchers to find a team to work with. I think he made it clear to them and to us that we needed to look at where it sits within the coordinated community response. I'm sure he'll be talking to you more about the importance of that later. But just to say that that was one of the keystones that of our research at the very beginning. We also knew that lots of researchers were calling generally for more holistic studies. They didn't just want to know why they change, but also how change happens, and how knowledge about these perpetrators can influence the wider intervention system. I mean, there is, although most evaluations of perpetrator programs do focus on the question of do they make men change, there is, of course, completely the possibility that domestic violence perpetrator programs could be doing a worthwhile job and be worthwhile, even if they didn't change any men's behaviour, because simply by being able to do, for example, more informed assessments around things like child contact cases, child safety, our social services, and simply knowing what is happening with a man, and then not just being this kind of missing person around the table when you're making multi-agency decisions about a case. So our research question was, as I've said already, what do they contribute? I'm going to really quickly go through our research design. It's all in the full report, which there is a link to at the end. We basically did a longitudinal telephone survey. So we had 100 women whose partners or ex-partners had attended a programme. We had 62 women whose partners hadn't attended the programme, and we spoke to them over 6 time points, from before the programme started to 12 months after the start date of the programme. We don't talk about end dates of the programme because we sampled from different programmes and they had different lengths of time. We also did in-depth interviews with 64 men on programmes, 48 partners or ex-partners, and we did 2 interviews, very long ones near the start and near the end of the programme. We did some other research as well, which is on this slide. I'm not going to read it all out, but because I'm not really talking much about the findings of these parts today, but these again are all available on the website. So our research sample was 12 Respect accredited domestic violence perpetrator programs. This means that they had met a certain level of quality standard because they'd met their accreditation standard. They were across England, Wales and Scotland. They were often nested within larger organisations like children's charities. And our comparison group was from women's support services where there wasn't a domestic violence perpetrator programme available in their area. Okay, just before I move on to tell you about this slide, I'm just going to flick back a minute and say that the comparison group didn't particularly work, and I'm not going to be talking about the findings from that today. That's not to hide the findings, it's to say that actually our comparison group reduced in most of the forms of violence and abuse that we looked at in a pretty similar way actually to the domestic violence perpetrator group. Now I know that some people will then could interpret that as, well, in that case it wasn't successful, but I hope that by the end of the presentation I'll have convinced you as to why we still say that we believe that they are useful. Okay, so this is physical and sexual violence, and this is the percentage who said that this happened before compared with after. So we have the paler blue, the turquoisey blue as being the baseline before the programme started, and the darker, the royal blue, being 12 months after the man started on the program. And I think what we see is actually quite remarkable. I think even some of the perpetrator program staff were quite surprised to see just how dramatic this reduction was in many cases. So we see that, for example, made you do something sexual that you did not want to do, and used a weapon against you. We see that this went down from around 3 in 10 women saying that this happened to them. This is the quantitative data. This is based on what the women told us was happening, down to 0, 12 months after them starting the program. We see that Thor tried to strangle, choke, drown, or smother you, and punched, kicked, burnt, or beaten you. Similarly, reduced from more than half of the women saying that they were experiencing this before the program started to virtually none 12 months on. Other forms of violence and abuse here: threatened to kill you or somebody close to you, slapped you, pushed you, or threw something at you. They reduced substantially again, and punched or kicked walls or furniture, slammed doors, smashed things, or stamped around. Again, a massive reduction. You know, we're seeing nearly all for that one, and the indicator above, slapped you, pushed you, or threw something at you. We're seeing nearly all women reporting that this was happening before the program, and we see this reducing substantially. All of these are statistically significant reductions. Now, if I did have the slide here with the comparison group mapped on, we would actually see pretty similar reductions over time. Now, I'll just briefly explain some of the differences that we had between the two groups, and why we don't show this data. We found that the women in our comparison group were far more likely to be separated from their partner at the time they entered our research. So while they did have similar levels of violence before the program started, they'd often joined their group work program at the point that they had separated from their partner. So we see that in the comparison group, only 13% at the beginning of the research were still with their partner. This dropped to about 7% near the end of the program. I know some people have then interpreted our research as saying, oh, well, that means that perpetrator programs are simply keeping couples together. Actually, the opposite was true, because in the intervention group, in the domestic violence perpetrator group, around 50% of the women were still in the relationship at the beginning of the research, and this dropped to about 33% by the end. So actually, there was more people who separated during a perpetrator program than there was in the other intervention. But this is one of the reasons why we don't think that the comparison group is useful to display in these tables, because we think that for a lot of the women it was the separation rather than behavioural change of the man that was creating that change. The other big difference between the two groups was around child contact. So we found that in the domestic violence perpetrator program group, most of the women, most of the men wanted to see their child, but there was contested contact. Whereas in the comparison group, the reason why there often wasn't any child contact was because the man didn't want child contact. Okay, now what you see then in this chart actually is the sign of things to come throughout the presentation. What we see here is that the more directly physical or sexual an act was, the more likely it is to reduce through a domestic violence perpetrator program. So, you know, you see sexual, weapons, punched, strangled, virtually being eliminated through the perpetrator program. Things which are kind of one step removed, like threatened to kill you or somebody close to you, obviously still violence and abuse, but not less direct, and punched or kicked walls or furniture, slamming, being violent around the woman and or children, reducing less. As I said, this is important as we go on, because this really is one of the kind of key findings from our study, that domestic violence perpetrator programs are far more successful in ending physical and sexual violence than they are other elements of harassment and coercive and controlling behaviours. And you begin to see that even more then in this chart, where we see that while the use of harassment abuse also continued to show strong and consistent decreases, it did remain in the lives of about half of the women. So this still shows some decent reductions. Things like insulted you or made you feel bad about yourself, reducing from 91 to 48%. The things that scared or intimidated you, similar reduction. Belittled or humiliated you. Some of these dropping at least by half, often more. Deliberately interfered with or damaged your property, 64 down to 9%. So, how you feel about these figures really depends. I don't know, you can read them both ways. You can read them and say, well, this is brilliant. This is a consistent decrease across everything that you've measured so far in terms of, the physical, the sexual, the harassment, the other forms of abuse. It's all reducing, it's all good. Or you can look at it the other way and say, actually, for nearly half of the women, they were still experiencing things that scared or intimidated them. For nearly half of the women, they were still sometimes insulted and made to feel bad about themselves. So there's two ways of viewing these figures. Self-perceived safety is a question which we feel is really important measure. We asked women, how safe do you feel? And we see that from the baseline, from before the programme, we see that most women, around about 70-something%, it's Friday night here, I can't do my sums, around about 70-odd% said that they didn't feel safe, either not safe at all or a little unsafe. And by the end, we see that a similar number, around 81%, were saying that they felt somewhat or very safe. So this chart, I think, is useful, that it does clearly show that women on the large are feeling much safer after their partner or ex-partner has attended a perpetrator programme. Some of the ways in which this was happening, just going to check my timing. Some of the ways in this was happening was expanded understandings of abuse. So Felix says, kind of, when I first spoke to you, I'd say it was only a push, but I've learned that this is still violence. Saying, oh, well, I only pushed her to get out the door, is as bad as a punch or a slap. Matthew says how I am around her, how controlling I am. I thought they were little, but they're huge. I never thought of that. I thought I was just doing what every bloke did, and it's just not. Where we say time 2, that means that it was the interview at the end. If you see any that say time 1, that was the interview near the beginning. Reduce violence and abuse. So Simon was saying actually that the abuse is still continuing, but it's reducing. So 3 times over 6 months where it's been majorly aggressive or abusive. Before the course, it was once a week. Similarly, Alice says, I think there's been both. There's still quite a lot of verbal abuse, and at times, but much more seldom, physical aggression. All of this comes back down to what our expectations are around the programs and on what we count as success. Is less violence worth doing? Is it worth running programs for less violence, or is it just no violence? Some of the ways in which this was, the men were able to particularly stop the physical abuse was through the use of tools and techniques which they were taught, particularly in the early sessions of these programs. So Ken says the breathing, the counting down from 10. I wish I could have done it years ago. It really seemed to really calm down. And Hazel says, there's been 2 incidents where he's been physically violent. He now stands back. He knows he's overstepped a mark. Whereas before he started the course, he wouldn't know that. It's a massive difference. And he'll take himself out. He'll say, I need a time out. I'm going. And he's gone. Um, if you remember back from those 6 measures of success, one of them was respectful communication. And this is where we start to see, again, you can look at these figures 2 ways. You can either say, well, this is great. All of these women have got to some extent a better, overall, some women have a better life after their partner's been on a perpetrator program. All of these are reducing over time. Domestic violence, DVP means domestic violence perpetrator, negotiates during disagreements, listens to what I have to say, acts in a considerate manner. All of these are consistent in that they're reductions, but you can look at it the other way and say, actually, there are still problems here. You can see that yourself. When we looked at the ways in which, when we asked people about how things were better, being able to engage with disagreements was one of the things that both men and women talked about. So Bart says, I think she perhaps felt more comfortable about being able to respond back to me. At the programme, we talk about the pyramid of power. I was probably sitting at the top, and now things were a bit more equal. And Hilary says that she used to feel constantly on edge, like he was a ticking time bomb. She couldn't have even said something normal like it's sunny outside because he would have kicked the table or put a hole in the wall or something. De-escalation, the men talked as well about learning techniques and tools which help them with this. Expanded space for action. So this is around this is a term which Liz came up with, Liz Kelly, around how much space, and it's basically about freedom. How much space, freedom does a woman have to be able to live her life free from his coercive and controlling behaviours? And again, we see on this slide exactly what I was saying before. We see reductions to varying amounts, but we see that some things for some women are still continuing. So if you look at something like, well, I mean, one of the ones which I think is often particularly telling, and if you've read Evan Stark's book, you'll also perhaps see these two as important. Tries to change the way I dress or my appearance, and prescribes or criticises the way housework is done. Kind of trying to mould women by gender norms into what they see as the perfect woman that they want her to be within his life. We see that both of those did actually reduce quite significantly. So we go from around from around 5 or 6 in 10 down to 1 or 2 in 10 women saying that this continued after the programme. I'll also just say that this analysis doesn't include reductions. This only includes, did it continue to happen, yes or no. We do have data on some of these where we say, did it happen often, sometimes, rarely, or never? And we can still do that analysis. And that would obviously show an even better picture on change. But we wanted to start really at this kind of baseline level. Did it happen or not? Things like try to look at my messages and contacts, again still continuing in 22% for 22% of the women, but a decent reduction. We looked at some of the ways which this enhanced space for action was affecting the women's lives. Jill says, I think now he gets frustrated with me because I've sort of got to such a degree of being in and not doing anything and not mixing with people because I thought I can't be doing the arguments. And now I'm making the excuses. I can't be bothered. I'll do it tomorrow. She says it's almost like you become a hermit and you get anxieties and you don't even realise that they're there. And Sophie says how things were before. I had to go shopping, and she explains she tried to call in at a shop on the way back, but because it was going to be his birthday the following week, and she was only 5 minutes late and he was already sat out waiting for her. Jessica also says that she is still worried about testing that expanded space for action. So she says, I think I've still got that issue with pulling back all the time, but I think that's probably more me, too scared to make that first step to see, if dip your toe in the water to see how hot it is type thing. Because there hasn't been an occasion where I've been on a night out or where I've been alone with my friends for a long amount of time. Um, and she goes on to say she needs to do that to see if he will react in a normal way that every normal partner should react. So this is the other thing. A lot of the women had their kind of wings clipped for so long that even if he had changed and wasn't going to use violence and abuse, they were often there wasn't just kind of this ability to say, okay, everything's great now, he's changed, I'm going to go out and act normally, because either they'd got into patterns, which meant that they could no longer just do that. They couldn't act normal, normally in inverted commas. They couldn't just go out because they had stopped doing that. Perhaps they'd lost friendship groups. Perhaps they'd stopped being invited out. Perhaps they were scared about testing that because at that point they're not just testing is he going to use violence and abuse. They're testing, has this whole thing been a waste of time? Is the relationship over? We looked at the awareness of the impact on self and others, and we saw fewer reductions in this, but there was a few problems with this measure. So we had in our interviews when we were looking at what success meant, we found that lots of the women wanted men to understand the impact that they had had on them, on their family. Now, when we tried to measure this, given that we were asking the women, not the men, the quantitative questions, it kind of got into we're asking women whether they think that their partner understands the impact of themselves on others, if you see what I mean. The quantitative members of our team didn't like asking these questions. So you're best off viewing these answers as a woman's perception of whether these were the case. So we see improvements, but to a lesser degree. I mean, if you look at any of these kind of charts now, and then you compare that, I'm just going to quickly flick back to that first one. That is much, that is a different type of graph to any of these other ones in terms of the reductions. Okay, we looked at effect on how much they felt that they had a greater awareness of the self and others. And we asked interviews again in the qualitative section about how this change was happening. And we began to see some gender differences here actually between some of the women and the men. So Justin says, I thought I was infallible till then. Todd says, the thing is, I didn't care. I had no empathy with her. I couldn't give a shit how she felt. It wasn't my problem as far as I was concerned. Sebastian, never even crossed my mind that the impact of my behaviour and the effect it has on other people, because again, I always had this thought that the king of the castle type person, it never really crossed my mind until now. I was probably aware of it in the back of my mind somewhere, but choose to ignore it. I mean, that's an interesting quote in itself, and it's a quote that we use in an article that we've just written. Even within that paragraph, he starts off by saying, "Never even crossed my mind," and then by the end of that paragraph, he's saying, "Well, I probably was aware of it in the back of my mind somewhere, but chose to ignore it." Adele says, I don't think he was aware at all. It was all about him. Elaine, he's incredibly self-centered. It's all about him. Grace, I don't even think he did know. The taking over control with the cooking and stuff, he thought he was being helpful, not controlling. I don't think he acknowledged the fact of making me feel about this big. I think he thought that he was just having his opinion and that I wouldn't be affected by his opinion and that I wouldn't feel bad and I wouldn't feel affected. And Holly, I say that completely genuinely, and I wholeheartedly believe that he never thought he was doing anything wrong. So there was a bit of a difference here. The women were much more kind of gracious in believing that they did just need help and that they did just need educating, that they weren't doing it on purpose, and that they did just need to think about their behaviour. Whereas unfortunately, some of the men were very clearly saying, I didn't care. I didn't know, maybe I knew. So a bit of a difference there. Um, Barry saying it was the awareness of how it changed how other people outside the relationship saw, which was an important moment for him. Right at the beginning, I knew it had affected others, and when I couldn't see the children, I knew it had affected others. And when I spent a day in the police station, I knew it had affected others. When I saw my name on the front page of the local newspapers, I knew it had affected others. So he went on to say, it was that was a key moment for him. So we looked at how change happens as well. We think that this is really kind of one of the big benefits of us using qualitative techniques as well as quantitative techniques in looking at change in domestic violence perpetrator programs. We found that change was not a process that involves kind of a light bulb moment. It wasn't a kind of aha. Of course, I've been thinking that I've been helping, but in fact, I now realise I've been controlling all of this time. But rather, we found it was like kind of a series of sparks that were different for each man, and some of which do or do not light up. And this is why we title our report "Steps Towards Change." We're not saying that we're not saying any proportion of men have changed. We're saying that steps towards change were made. So Kieran, this is Liz's favourite quote. If you can have a favourite quote from a perpetrator, this is hers. Kieran says, "I don't think there was a moment during this programme. They all say like the penny drops. Suddenly there's this light bulb moment, and there never is. It's like a little fairground machine where you put a coin in and it bounces off various little pegs, and it's only working its way down to the bottom. The programme is like that. I know I will be remembering it when I'm in my 70s and 80s. But it's never like this light bulb moment. It's like this little coin that you drop in and it bounces around for ages, and it sort of argues with yourself, and all of a sudden, dink, it's in the bottom before you know it." We found that the techniques were important, especially for the physical violence, time-out technique, positive self-talk. We found that the length of the programme was important. Men talked a lot about needing time to absorb the content and time to decide that they did want to change. A lot of men weren't necessarily highly motivated to change their behaviour for their partner or ex-partner at the beginning of the programme. Often it was around wanting access to their children that they were initially on for, and they had to decide that in fact they did want to make these changes in their life. The group work was really important, being able to see oneself in others and being challenged by peers. And we found that men had really stereotypical notions of being a man, a protector, a provider, the head of the household, which really fed into this sense that he knew best, following Evan Stark, the micromanagement of everyday life. Remaking kind of gender was fundamental, understanding, unravelling male privilege and entitlement, and learning how to be men differently in a heterosexual relationship and as a parent. I'm coming towards the end of my time, I know now. If I could just have maybe 5 more minutes. We just did want to kind of emphasize the importance of gender. At the moment in the UK, there's a lot of kind of push towards shorter programs and gender neutral programs. So a lot of our work on gender really does echo the work of Evan Stark. For Stark, the foundation of coercive control is what he calls the universal masculine, the ability to define the legitimate standard of what is rational, reasonable, and right in relationships, which then affords men the entitlement to continually regulate a partner's thoughts, feelings, behaviours, and actions. We also found that men developed a very personalised repertoire of tactics that over time enabled him to entrap his partner through the gradual reduction of autonomy and pleasure. So I think I've got 1 or 2 quotes on this. Holly says, he wanted me to perform when he wanted me to. He wanted me to stay home with the kids, not have any life outside. I couldn't get my hair done. He'd want to know, why have you got your hair done? Who have you got your hair done for? But if we were going somewhere together, I'd have to look gorgeous, perfect. He says he wanted me to be like a doll for him, basically. He wanted me to do what he wanted when his family were there. I had to keep up this pretense I was the perfect wife. I just think he wanted someone that he could like press the off button on. And Simon and Dexter, from the man's perspective, talking about how they came to kind of understand what we call the harms of the hegemonic project. Simon says, as a man now, I'm proud if my son sees me cry, that he knows my daddy is not a robot. My daddy is actually human. He does have feelings. He says, I was only happy when I wanted to be happy, whereas now my emotions come out more. And he gets to see properly what a man is meant to be. Dexter says, it's opened me up as a person. I feel more comfortable around men and women. I'm more open. My heart is more open. And he also talks about how his version of what a man is and what a man should be in modern society looks like. I have 3 conclusion slides. We have new questions and challenges in terms of methodology, in terms of the way that we think domestic violence perpetrator program evaluations should be run. I maybe won't go through each of these because I'm not sure how many of you are actually planning to do evaluations. Just to say that, we learned things through our study design that we would like to see kind of moving forward. We'd like to pay it forward in terms of what we learned from Ed Gondorf in planning our study. We'd like to do the same to other people who are planning studies in this area. We have new challenges and questions for programs to think about, but these may be pretty UK-centric. We found that we needed more consistency in the amount of work on parenting and children, more innovation needed on how to shift coercive control. Ending the physical and sexual violence was far easier than stopping the coercive and controlling behaviours. Men who are on the programme because of child contact, their motivations and needs and the needs of their female partners are probably different to the men who are on for other reasons. The women's support services need more investment, and there needs to be more direct services for children. Again, this is our learning from the UK. And we also had new challenges for policymakers and commissioners. Again, I don't know how much they're going to chime with what you're facing there, but we found that there were questions around child contact, people who were there because of child contact. For example, our child contact agency asks when contact is restarted that the man has to give an apology to the children, but not to the women. And we do have these concerns that these ongoing desires by funding bodies to have shorter and cheaper programs lose precisely what the men talked about enabling them to change, which was, reformulating gender, arguing with yourself about change, wanting to change. And we have concerns that it will play into kind of an instrumental tick box approach that so many of the men begin with. If I finish this program, I can see my kids. If I finish this program, the relationship will continue. We think it might feed into that. Okay, that really is the end now. Electronic copy of this report, and we have maybe 8 or 9 other Project Mirabal publications. We have much more around children, and much more around process, and much more about everything. So it's available at that website. And I'll try and come back in the room, so to speak.
Thank you, Nicole. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes before our next presenter. Does anybody have any questions for her?
Hi, Nicole. Thanks very much. Do you have a specific curriculum that was used for this research, or how did that work?
No, we didn't. We had to sample from, I think it was 12 different programs, even to get those numbers that we did get. We were obviously hoping for larger numbers. So no, we could best define them as having some combination of feminist-inspired cognitive behavioural type work, but the actual exercises that they did in class varied. Yeah, it varied.